expedite shipments? Can you do that for agriculture? Can you do that for small value trade, which has a particular impact, of course, on development too, because a lot of traders in developing countries are dealing in smaller volume trade, tend to trade a lot informally, but this helps to formalize a system in a way that's predictable. Border agency cooperation, I do a lot of work, as I said before, in sub-Saharan Africa, and border agency cooperation is tremendously important. It's almost impossible for one country alone. I saw this a lot when I was at USTR too, to make a difference without having some level of cooperation with its neighbors. And then the formalities to importation, freedom of transit, and cooperation within agencies and with customs officials. So then I wanted to go a little bit down to trade agreements and talk about where development comes up in trade agreements. So trade agreements tend to be structured, most of them like this. They have a component that covers market access, and then they have what sometimes are called negotiating issues, what I would call rule of law issues, or even building blocks for development, rules of origin, SPS, TPT, trade facilitation, investment, IP, labor and environment, and regulatory coherence. How are regulations made? How are they implemented? Which does tend to be one of the biggest factors that I can see impacting development. So these legal frameworks, I think, are very important, but at the end of the day, all of these rules have to be implemented by countries. And that means that you have to have a whole system in place to do any one of these things and make it really work in practice. And then, of course, capacity building is another big component of this, and one that gets talked about a lot. And capacity building really needs to facilitate all of these other things. So capacity building, and I think Caleb probably will talk more about this too, became really embedded in trade agreements in the United States with the CAFTA-DR and is now part of TPP. And I had a group of students, I was supervising at Harvard Law School this year, do a project looking at a whole range of trade agreements and trying to determine where development came up, either explicitly or implicitly. So these are some of the findings of that work that I thought I would share. One is this building block notion that I talked about before. I think that one of the more important aspects is really how you build legal and regulatory systems that will work for trade. It's something that impacts every US company going into another market, and it's something that impacts every producer in those markets, small or large. And for most of the companies I work with, the smaller size companies, these are the things that will make or break whether or not there's an economic opportunity. Does the system work? Do you know what the rules are? Can you go someplace if there's a problem? Those are the things I think that really are part of the frameworks of the WTO and trade agreements, but need to be thought about a bit more carefully in development. And so there are ways that that can be integrated into a trade agreement, but then it also needs to happen through capacity building and other measures. One thing I just want to note here is that I think there's some really interesting models that are starting to surface. I think the trade facilitation agreement is a fascinating model on development because it says that you don't have to do everything at once, and countries can actually determine where their strengths and weaknesses are. So they can look at all of the requirements of the trade facilitation agreement. It categorizes them into A, B, and C. So what can you do now? What are you already doing? What are you planning to do? And where do you really need the help? And I think from a development perspective, that's a really interesting approach. It's not saying everything has to be done at once, and it's really acknowledging that maybe there will be some actions that need to be taken beyond signing the agreement or adhering to the agreement that are going to impact how it works in practice. I think that the US CAFTA DRFTA is really interesting as well. And then this next one is the staging of commitments is something that I become quite fascinated with. When I was at USTR, we negotiated the US-Morocco FTA. And in the US-Morocco FTA, agriculture was a big topic. But the Moroccan government, I think, was still developing its agricultural sector. And so the approach then was to find some way to stage the commitments so that that development could still continue to take place. I think that's another really interesting model to look at. Some of the agreements that the students looked at, including some of the European agreements, which I think in some ways have some shortcomings on development, but in this particular case had some interesting examples of linking with other sectors that really matter for development. And this is things like transportation, tourism, energy, where there's going to be a big connection in the market between trade and development. And then how do you encourage private sector consultation and input into the process? That is explicitly in some of the agreements, but it's something that I think could probably be a bit more pronounced through all of these mechanisms. Very quickly, here are a couple of ways that TPP, I think, has advanced the discussion on development. So for one, TPP has provisions on small and medium-sized enterprises and women, which is an exciting development, and I think those disciplines could probably be deepened even more going forward. It also has things like TBT and SPS, standards and sanitary regulations, some more depth on how to tailor those provisions. This is one thing that I think a lot of countries continually try to work through, including the United States. How do you really tailor those processes to make sure that they deliver the trade benefits that you want and the development benefits that you want? Capacity building is explicitly part of the TPP. It is a soft commitment. It's not a hard commitment in the way that other things are, but it's in there, which I think matters. TPP also has anti-corruption, which I think is also quite notable. And then it has some other references, global supply chains, which are becoming, I think, more and more of a way of thinking about these things and focusing them. I'll talk about that in just a moment, is also part of TPP. So the trade preference programs, like I said, have been sort of the kind of cornerstone of trade development. And I think that will very likely remain that way, although I do think that now that's a foundation on which we need to really continue to build, because trade preferences open the door to market access to developed country markets, but they don't really help countries get there. And so I think we do need to think about a whole range of measures beyond trade preference programs when we really think about effective development through trade. GSP in the United States is not the only country that has GSP. It's kind of the benchmark program. It has eligibility criteria that Congress sets, and it has rules of origin that sometimes are noted as the solution and sometimes noted as one of the big complexities to the programs. Europe also has the GSP program, and Europe has a GSP Plus program that has enhanced requirements on labor and environment. We have then a number of other programs. We have a trade preference program with the Caribbean that has two parts to it. One is permanent and one is not permanent. We have the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which just got extended until 2025. And now the discussion with Africa is focusing around where should the trade relationship go next? What should it look like now beyond AGOA? At the AGOA ministerial last summer, this was a big theme. And countries are trying to decide now, what do we want to think about in our trade relationship with the United States, and how do we make sure that we can make the most out of AGOA in these last 10 years? And there's been a lot of debate over whether AGOA has worked or not and what it's covered, and I'm happy to get into that a little bit more too. And then we have several trade preference programs with Haiti as well. Hope 1 and 2, is there a 3 too? I think there's just a 2, good, okay, slides are right. Good, excellent. Okay, again, I'm sorry for going through all of this relatively quickly, but that will give us more time for discussion, and hopefully this helps to kind of paint the landscape. So aid for trade, again, is one of the big topics on trade development, and sometimes this is where the conversation starts. But it really has to relate back to everything else that I've just laid out, because aid for trade is meant to be a mechanism to facilitate. It doesn't itself create these legal commitments or a binding structure for trade and development, but it's definitely a tremendous tool. And there's been a lot of discussion over what aid for trade actually encompasses, and this was one of the big topics when the Doha round was launched. Of course, that has had a long history, but when it was launched, there was a bit of a focus among a number of countries on how to really define aid for trade. And these were some of the things then that came out: technical assistance. How do you help countries negotiate? How do you help countries develop trade strategies and implement trade agreements that they've already become a party to? Infrastructure is always one of the points where, is it included, is it not included? But you can't trade without roads. You can't trade without an ICT network. So I think that now the prevailing thinking is that does need to be included in how we think about aid for trade, and we need to link that hard infrastructure with the legal infrastructure that I've been talking about. Productive capacity in trade development. How do you help countries diversify what they're exporting? How do you identify your comparative advantage and build upon that? This is something that every country is constantly thinking about, again, including here. This is a big topic of conversation